So maybe you can share the screen, Niranga, your
Yes,
panel.
I'm doing now. Hope it's visible now.
Uh, Not yet to me. I can only see the panel colleagues are here.
Okay, wait a
Uh,
minute.
okay.
It should be visible now.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So let's begin the session. I hope all of you are doing good. And so good morning or good afternoon or even late evening in people joining from South Asia or Southeast Asia. This is part of the global webinar series on Eyes on the Storm webinar series. And this particular segment, we have a deep dive session on capabilities on early warning system for food security, conflict, and migration. And on behalf of International Water Management Institute and our organizing partners as well, the CGR, FuseNet, University of Santa Barbara, the Jamil Observatory, and many others, including my CGR colleagues from the Alliance, are joining with us. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this important discussion. As this segment is much more complex to unfold with the impact of climate change, and we cannot see these three elements in isolation. As you know, El Nino has struck many parts of the world last year. Drought, floods, crop failure, and extreme heat has been also been struck by many countries, including Europe, which is being a developed country. They do see a similar social vulnerabilities to extreme events, and many countries which are highly vulnerable, leading to more food insecurity, displacement, and at times it leads to conflict. So, how do we really unfold what is the science behind and what framework we should have? So, we have global experts joining on that. At the same time, at the IWMI and the CGR, we have huge capabilities to highlight on strengthening early warning systems beyond the single hazard detection. Because for food security conflict, you cannot just depend on per se of knowing where the flood is happening. We need to look at forecast of food prices, people displacement. There is a lot of angle around the climate security. And we do have a lot of tools like Climate Security Observatory. My colleagues are going to speak. And from IWMI, there are other set of anticipatory action tools like South Asia Drought Management System, Aware for early warning, early action, and early finance. But importantly, the most promising tool has also been regarded significantly in the phase of FuseNet, the integrated phase classification. So we are going to learn a lot because I don't think just science is not enough in my viewpoint because we need to bring different institutions, global experts when it comes to the last mile connectivity of early warning to cash voucher, relocating vulnerable population, and the much more important is the coordinated governance. So we are going to hear a lot from the leading voices at the interface of the climate, food security, and migration, and the peace building examples with some, the predictive models, the community-based monitoring capacities, which we are going to hear from use cases from Sri Lanka. So as we dive into the conversation, you are free to have your questions, responses to all the experts, and we are looking forward to your insightful opportunities and impactful discussions. So, having said about my remarks, let me also introduce the main speaker, and rest of that will be introduced by Sandra, who will be leading this, moderating the session. Let me just start beginning with the speaker from the FuseNet, Karen Tober, who is an agroclimatology advisor in the FuseNet. It's quite popular. I have been watching that for many, many years, and we are going to hear a lot from Karen today. Specifically, from she is coming from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and the Agroclimatology Center. She integrates a lot of, I would call the climate variables, the water availability data from space, and how that can be useful to produce a meaningful food security outlook and provide the livelihood analysis. She comes with the background of over 20 years of at the Conservation International. She developed tools for natural resource management using remote sensing and various climate models, downscaling information. And I believe that's the right setup where we would like to provide this rapid talk. Without much further delay, let me introduce and ask Karen to share your presentation
and provide your intervention. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen, one sec. All right, does everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. Yes, my background is how to use remote sensing for applications, and particularly conservation and now food security applications. While I sit at NASA Goddard, I also sit at the FuseNet management team, which was at USAID, and now FuseNet is at the State Department. And we're continuing on, but just have a new home. So I'm going to give a brief overview of FuseNet, particularly focusing on information we use to inform our analyses, pulling from conflict information and migration. And then Tamuka, who's our FuseNet regional scientist, is going to be on the panel, so he can give much more detailed information about work he's doing in East Africa. So many of you already know FuseNet, but just really quickly overview, FuseNet is an early warning system. Really, we're providing analysis and forecast of acute food insecurity. And while a lot of people use FuseNet's data, the main goal of FuseNet is to inform the US government on where and how much foreign assistance is needed. So FuseNet is a 40-year program now, and it has changed a lot over those 40 years and really expanded in capabilities. And it's also expanded the networks as well. It's a partnership that pulls together all the available data in a convergence of evidence approach to try to get at these numbers of how many people are in need of food assistance. And the types of data that we're pulling in we're just every year seems to try to bring in more and more data sets, whether agriculture, conflict, hazards, markets and trades data. So it really is a lot of information that we're analyzing and constantly monitoring, just moving forward, looking at what's happening now, but also what's going to happen a year and a half from now. And that's where agroclimatology data is really useful for that really far outlooks. So as I mentioned, so FuseNet really produced these monthly reports for the countries that we monitor, but a lot of the data is available like sub-monthly, especially the agroclimatology data. But with this data, we are trying to assess who is at risk for food insecurity, where are they, what are the drivers that are causing this risk for acute food insecurity, how severe is it, and also that when will they need food assistance. So we have all these reports that we published, markets and trade, agroclimatology, conflict, and of course the IPC analyses, and these are all available on the FuseNet website. Agroclimatology was really our, at the start, kind of our bread and butter product. Basically, FuseNet was formed after, or the program was launched after the 1984 severe famine in Ethiopia. And as an early warning system, it started with the idea of like, how can we better know when famine may happen, and how can we use the latest technologies to do this? And satellite information was one of those technologies that was an extremely valuable, it continues to be extremely valuable. This is an example here this is CHIRPS data, so precipitation anomalies, like 3-month anomalies for the 1984 Ethiopia famine. So it kind of shows the really severe drought and crop failures in 1984. And then we see in 2015, there was an equally severe drought. But there is a difference. Now we have, many years later, we have early warning systems in place. We have international community monitoring and multiple early warning systems to really be ahead of this potential famine. And because of that, the resources were allocated. The Ethiopian government really helped be on top of this and to allocate the resources, and the US government and Europe and a lot of partners around the world were able to all work together to avert famine in 2015. But as everything in this world, it seems that it's getting more complicated, and also we're seeing an increase in deadly food crises over the last decade. And climatology alone, we can't just rely on that information, and so more and more we rely on other data sets. We know we have to get more conflict data and migration data, and so we're constantly changing our methods and analyses to incorporate new data to really better understand how we can predict what's going to happen farther and farther into the future. So what's going on with this trend in deadly food crises really is driven by climate change, conflict, and macroeconomic shocks. So FuseNet is very much incorporating all the available data to understand these drivers of acute food insecurity. And we do pull all this data together, and often what people see are the IPC reports, which just gives a category of risk or a number of people in need. But the reality, there's so much more data in the background, and all the data is also available on the website. So we wanted to produce a website, make the capabilities within our FuseNet website so people can visualize the data that we're looking at. And we did this last year trying to visualize the Sudan conflict. So we know we're pulling in this migration data and conflict data and air climatology data and markets of trade data, but we wanted to stand up this site where anyone could interact with that data and also look at the data. So we did this last year, and I was going to now just step through like a couple of screenshots of this web portal that we stood up, and all the data, again, is already available on the FuseNet website, but it pulls it all together for anyone to look at. And this is our FuseNet data explorer. And this is what you typically see with FuseNet, where you see the IPC classifications, and this is Sudan. And now we had the ACLED conflict data pulled into this site where you can click on an ACLED event and see exactly what happened and where it overlays with our classifications of acute food insecurity. And also within this site, pulling in the land scan population data. So we have the density, population densities, and then the IOM migration flow data. We worked with IOM to build out the API to ensure that we can pull it to our site. And we also worked with CIAT as well. So we're all together working with CIAT to pull this data in and make it a more accessible data set for anyone to pull in the API. And here's an example of looking at how this migration data can be overlaid with agroclimatology data in the database. So we have CHIRPS data here, so CHIRPS anomalies, like a 3-month anomaly. And what FuseNet is looking at is, say you have a conflict event in Sudan up here, and then we pull in the IOM data, where are people moving? And we want to know, are they moving to areas where there may already be drought or crop failure? Because that's going to be more people who need food assistance in those areas where they're migrating to. And that's important information to account for in our IPC classifications. So this sort of analysis that we're doing really highlights how this convergence of weather and conflict and migration, and how important it is to understand those dimensions in assessing the number of people in need of food assistance. Being able to visualize the data can help understand the data and help humanitarian planners identify and really pinpoint where people are need assistance and where there's an increasing need, or what are the trends in where there may be more need in the future. And also seeing, where people are moving to, and are they moving to areas where there's already constrained resources or IPC4 phase classifications or severe drought conditions. So this exercise, we did a visualization exercise. We did it just for Sudan, try to test out how we can look at the data and how useful it would be for others to interact with the data. But we are going to create similar visualizations for the other geographies where FuseNet works. And as always, if you want to learn more about FuseNet, the FuseNet website has all the markets and trade data, agroclimatology data, livelihoods, nutrition. There's also a lot of learning materials on how to get started with using the Data Explorer, and learning materials on what a FuseNet, on the IPC classifications, and it's all there on that site. All right, that's just my brief overview of FuseNet. So I'd like to hand it back to the organizer at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for this excellent presentation. I think you have clearly demonstrated how the FuseNet has been over decades have proven the products for the US government, but equally how the humanitarian actors and also the countries have been managing the crisis into a more intense program over the years. I think from the presentation, I do see there is a clear urgency of practical way of utilizing the FuseNet product to more in terms of early financing and the anticipatory action tool to ensure that we break down those silos between the climate conflicts and migration. Because at the end of the day, if we have seasonal outlooks that links to food security outlook, I think nothing more than that would help the policymakers in a timely order. But we do see in Global South, there are issues with investing in data systems and partnership. I believe some of these learnings and the knowledge products which FuseNet have been shaping can be much more useful through the collective partnership as we drive on. Thanks again for giving this excellent presentation. Let me now move to the moderation session that will be led by Sandra Rukshul, Research Group Leader, Fragility, Conflict and Livelihoods and Water from the International Water Management Institute. Sandy is a senior researcher at the IWMI, in addition to the research group leader, as I highlighted. She comes with 20 years of experience, specializes in water and natural resource management, conflict mitigation, and peace building. She has worked in diverse countries in Middle East, Africa, Asia, and several other regions. What is more, her capability brings of the interface between the impact analysis and also bringing social research for development and human intervention. Without further delay, let me call Sandy to lead the panel and also provide the overall closing summary of this segment. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you very, very much, Giraj. And thank you so much, Karen, for your insightful opening. It's an absolutely eye-opening experience every time I hear about the FuseNet platform, all of the different sources of data, how to make sure it's fit for purpose, given how the technology is evolving, given how crises are evolving. And this is an amazing example to kick us off with, to think about. We have a really fantastic panel today that I'd like to introduce. So if the panelists wouldn't mind turning on their cameras, tell you a little bit about them. We have Tamuka Magadzire. I hope I pronounced that correctly this time. I've been practicing. Tamuka, thankfully, he joins us as a field scientist for the US Geological Survey, working on FuseNet, as Karen mentioned earlier. He's based at the Southern African Development Community headquarters in Botswana. He conducts agro-meteorological analysis, fieldwork, and training to support food security monitoring across SADC's 16 member states, inclusive of 5 FuseNet countries. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Surveying from the University of Zimbabwe, a Master of Arts in Geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a PhD in agro-meteorology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So an extraordinary background to share with us his technical experience that he's put towards the development of a number of tools, including GeoWRSI, GeoClim, and GeoCoff to assess climate and weather impacts on agriculture. I'm sure many people here are familiar with those tools. He has co-authored numerous articles as a guest author for Frontiers in Climate and contributes to drought and flood monitoring in Southern Africa, as I mentioned. Next, we also have Grazia Paccio. She is senior scientist and co-lead of the CGIAR-focused climate security team at the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAT. With over 15 years of experience, she specializes in building resilience in food and agricultural systems with a focus on the climate security nexus. Her research examines climate as a threat multiplier, heightening risks such as food insecurity, poverty, migration, and gender equality. Again, getting at the complexities we've started to see in tools like how FuseNet is developing to tackle these dynamic integrated issues of crisis. She manages a team of more than 50 staff in 16 countries, integrating climate security into policy and development. Grazia holds a PhD in development economics from the University of Sussex and has worked with organizations like IFAD and ODI over her career. Next, we have Sanjeev De Silva, a colleague of mine from IWMI. He is a senior regional researcher based in Sri Lanka. He specializes in natural resources governance, irrigation management, wetlands, and inclusive growth, and weather index insurance. With over 20 years of experience himself, he has worked across South and Southeast Asia. He has worked to strengthen institutions for socially inclusive and sustainable development, and he holds a master's degree in environmental law, which he has used in serving in leadership positions, including as manager of the environmental law program at IUCN Sri Lanka, where he has contributed to policy development, law enforcement, and capacity building. He has served as on national task forces, lectured at universities, and published extensively with his work shaping both policy and practice in the region. And I guess that's the punchline with this really dynamic panel, is it is going from policy to practice. And so it'll be very interesting to hear your reflections on the practical application of early warning system tools like that which Karen introduced to us earlier. So we will now move on to a couple of rounds of questions. Each speaker will have up to 3 minutes to reply to each question that they're asked. And this will be followed, as time allows, by a period of Q&A, verbal Q&A. Now, at the same time, we have the Q&A function here on the Zoom platform, so please feel free to submit your questions there. The panelists can answer them as we go along, as they are able to when they're not speaking, but we will also at the end try to get at a couple of those questions, like I said, depending on the time at the conclusion. So diving right into this, Tamuka, I'm going to start with you. First, FuseNet has decades of experience in food security early warning, as we've just heard about. How does FuseNet incorporate agroclimatology information, which is your area of expertise, into the food security monitoring framework? As the Southern Africa regional expert, can you also please tell us what role you play in that process? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that question. And thanks to IWMI for having me on your webinar. And greetings to everyone on the call. So I'm really honored to share our work in agroclimatology analysis for early warning in support of FuseNet and our partners in the region. Now, to answer your question, Sandra, it's important to understand FuseNet's general approach to food security monitoring. I think Karen has already alluded to this, that in our analysis framework, FuseNet covers the main factors that affect food security, including weather and climate, agricultural production, livelihoods, markets and trade, nutrition, as well as conflict. Now, the FuseNet team includes experts that cover all of these disciplines. And these factors do not operate in isolation, of course, but they often interact, which necessitates an in-depth understanding of the impacts and interactions. So the role of agroclimatology also becomes apparent when we consider that, close to 95% of agriculture in Southern Africa is rain-fed. And at the same time, over 60% of the region's population rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. So typically, when agricultural production is depressed due to drought, for instance, market prices of staple crops is going to increase. And this is going to reduce access to food by households. And speaking of conflict, FuseNet recently reported that the escalation of conflict in the eastern DRC, which is part of the SADC region, has resulted in large-scale displacement in predominantly agricultural households, which is going to mean reduced agricultural production as well. Now, the main approach that FuseNet uses to analyze and present food security early warning is through the production of regular food security outlooks. And these outlooks typically project conditions up to around 8 months in advance. And these outlooks provide a strong basis for decision support, enabling humanitarian agencies to anticipate and plan for food security crises. Now, our role in this as agroclimatologists is based on a very strong relationship between our science team and the FuseNet food security analysts who are in our decision support team. And this is one key takeaway that I would share, that strong link, or the need for that strong link between science and operations. Now, the second part of your question, you asked, what is my role in this? Now, as regional agroclimatologists, we provide local interpretation to the data product. Karen talked about a lot of the data product that our science team operationally produces in the US-based science institutions. We also provide validation and field data to allow for continuous improvement of these processes. And finally, and importantly, we work closely with local partners such as SADC, where I'm hosted, to strengthen their capacity in the use of these products, right? And for example, we contributed to the SADC Regional Humanitarian Appeal of 2024 in response to the strong El Nino event of that year. I'll conclude by saying that, the net in FuseNet, the networks are a key component of what we do, and we try and ensure that these networks benefit the entire community of analysts who are trying to contribute to better early warning for food security. Thanks. Over.
Thank you so much for that very eloquent answer. It's absolutely amazing to listen to you, as you say, the network, how we take all of these different data sets, data sources, and like I said before, make sure it's fit for purpose. How this can all, through that process of integration, reveal the dynamic nature of crises and what is required for intervention. I think this also highlights for us, and this is something I think, Grazia, you have spent a lot of time thinking about, how can we make sure these interventions, and therefore these tools that inform the interventions, conflict sensitive, focusing on peace dividends, right? So how do we go about that, and to understand the nature of conflict that fuels crisis is a component of doing that. So I'd like to switch over to Grazia and ask, what are some of the practical examples of how predictive analytics or risk mapping tools have helped anticipate compound risks, such as those that we're talking about at the intersection of, for example, drought and social unrest or other climatological events in these fragile contexts? What are some practical examples you can offer us that can provide some field lessons? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sandy, for this question, and then Giriraj and Amy overall for inviting me to join this really important discussion. But I really like the intervention of our panelists before me from FuseNet, and it's very much in line with the type of approach that we've been using. I mean, as I'm going to explain later on for these examples, and so I just wanted to briefly also bring about like a brief description of our framework, which is called the Compound Risk Framework, or CRF, which is very much similar to what FuseNet has been using throughout the years, with the only exceptions that we don't only look at the food crisis or food security, but the more sort of complex crisis across all the fragile contexts that we work in. So the CRF, for those who don't know it, but you can find also the links, we can share it online, is a holistic risk analysis approach that we apply to understand how the different risks interact and compound each other over time. So climate shocks, market volatility, as was mentioned by our colleague, governance challenges, but also conflict. And it does so to identify two critical things. One is the pathways to escalation, so how one stressor can trigger others, but also identify buffers that can protect those factors that can prevent somehow the crisis or slow down the crisis. So the examples that you were asking, right? So we have one example, clear example for Mozambique in Cabo Delgado. This was from a partnership with WFP and NORAD. As we all know, Cabo Delgado is facing armed insurgency, cyclones, floods that are recurrent, chronic underdevelopment. And using this framework, the CRF, we analyzed 22 years of monthly data to understand how the different risks interact with each other. And then our analysis through this framework showed that conflict severity specifically explained around 36% of the variation of the integrated food security phase classification, when floods and cyclones instead explaining 25% of that. But importantly, we don't only identify, as I said, these pathways to escalation, these triggers for the crisis, but also those buffers that can slow down the crisis. And we identify 3 of these. The first is functioning trade and transport corridors, stable crop arrangement and production, and market connectivity. Then we use scenario modeling. Great, thanks, Sandy. Scenario modeling demonstrated essentially that when both conflict intensity with flood risk surpassed critical thresholds, the likelihood of tipping from IPC level 2 and 3 to 4 becomes higher. So from all of these insights that we produced through the analysis, then WFP is been using these insights to somehow anticipate crisis, because they guide when and where to pre-position aid to secure a diversified transport corridors, but also to identify a channel agricultural support when it's needed. And I have other examples that I can explain later, but perhaps I should stop here for time's sake. Over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Gracia. It's always a marathon to try to run these in a way that allows everybody to speak, and the amount that you all are putting into a 3-minute time slot is incredible, which is why I shouldn't talk so much, so that we can listen to all of you. Now, I think though this example really does show us sort of the importance of bringing the big data that we're working with. We have more and more access to large data sets to put into these types of systems. How do we ground that? What does that mean from there, right? We're in the process of doing this, for example, under a new program developing a digital twin of a watershed in the Somali region of Ethiopia, where we're supporting WFP and UNHCR and the local government to understand how this watershed, what are the risks in this watershed, and how does that inform both humanitarian response and adaptation investments in a region that's trying to transition over to development programming. So to develop a platform or a tool like that, we have to go local and get the user perspective and make sure that the big data we're looking at and the patterns and trends we're seeing are as we understand them to be when we calculate these correlations. So I'm going to turn over to Sanjeev and ask you, please, from your field work in conflict-prone areas, how can local observations and community knowledge improve the detection of early signals of stress and contribute to more trusted early warning systems? Over to you, Sanjeev.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Sandra. I'm going to actually talk about the conflict areas as well as other areas as well, because I think it applies equally. I mean, if you look at it globally, if you think of, and this is particularly in terms of the idea of actually bringing in local participants into the data creation framework. And if you look at global international agreements, be it the Convention of Biodiversity, the Ramsar Convention of Wetlands, and possibly even the climate conventions, there's a lot of talk and recognition about local knowledge. But the techniques and tools and the science that has really not been there to bridge the considerable gap between reaching millions of people and making that real. And I think that's really, fundamental to what we are really talking about now. We have those tools, be it remote sensing or be it what we can do with mobile phones in terms of reaching different people. So I think it's a really powerful way of actually bringing in local understandings and observations if you frame it in terms of social ecological systems, right? So you are observers at a local level of both your natural environment, but you are also observers of demographics and people and the dynamics within populations. And I think that's what's really interesting. The diversity of information we can actually generate by bringing people living in their own environments as key informants in this process. And what that, of course, can lead to, moving to the trust part of the question, is that, well, you're then moving people away from being recipients of development solutions. Quite often in the climate response space, coming from very complicated technological systems, which they really don't understand. And so there's this huge gap in terms of, you don't trust what you don't understand, to actually being part of that system and feeling and generating, being part of the genesis of data that drives those systems. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is, of course, the level of nuances with which we can actually understand how climate vulnerability is actually manifested across different population groups. So no community or population is the same. There's diversity within and between. And so the ability to actually respond to that diversity again builds the level of trust within and the level of acceptance within communities that probably, hasn't really, or it's very difficult to do without these kinds of methods. And I think that's a really important point, because one of the things that we've really struggled with in terms of social science is to really, unpack social diversity at scale. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, I keep forgetting that I've muted myself. Thank you so much, Sanjeev. It reminds us, as a fellow social scientist, how do we make sure what we're doing is valid? How do we make sure it's relevant? How do we make sure it's seen as valuable to the user? So when we talk about user experience, it's not just about the agency moving the money, but it's about those who are acting in the midst of a crisis and bringing value to those observations. And how does that how do we incorporate that into our sense-making process and our decision-making process? Thank you for that, Sanjeev. I'm going to now turn back to Tamuka. Tamuka, I'd like to ask you this question. What are the current challenges in translating early warning into anticipatory action in Southern Africa? And how can national and regional systems be better aligned for timely response? What are your reflections there?
No, thank you very much for that question, Sandra. So since around 2015, when the first anticipatory action pilots were implemented, we've seen an upsurge in the use and implementation of anticipatory action, or AA for short, not only in Southern Africa, but in many parts of the world. And in Southern Africa, there have been over 25 AA activations in the past few years. Those are the ones I've at least come across. And at least 8 agencies are already operating in around 11 countries in the region. Now, these agencies use slightly different definitions and procedures, and this has actually been identified as one potential challenge to the wider adoption of AA. There is a widespread recognition of the advantages of early actions to preempt or mitigate the impact of hazards. So governments are eager to adopt this approach. But in order to better understand the challenges that face implementation of AA, I think we need to place this practice, a relatively new practice, within the overall framework of disaster risk management, which has been in place for at least a few decades. And most countries in the region, have got some form of national disaster risk management agency, which historically has been structured to respond to hazards when they strike. And they respond using verified data and information on populations affected, locations, the number, the severity, the sort of things that also Karen referred to in her presentation. So in Southern Africa, for example, there has been an ongoing effort to strengthen the capacities and systems to undertake annual vulnerability assessments, typically at the end of the season, and to get a reasonably accurate estimate of the number of food insecure people. And part of the need to produce reliable information on hazard impacts is to provide the most efficient response in the face, of course, of constrained budgets, both on part of the governments of affected countries, as well as humanitarian partners who would want to supply relief. So systems have already been well-tuned and established in this response framework over the years. But of course, knowledge evolves. And as I mentioned earlier, there is an acknowledgement that preemptive action can proactively protect lives due to the timeliness and reduce overall cost. of response. So in my view, the question is, how do we incorporate these changes, these advances in AA into a well-defined disaster response system? And fortunately, the will to see this exists both at technical and political level. So in Southern Africa, for example, we have the Regional Anticipatory Action Working Group, which comprises most of the humanitarian agencies that implement AA in Southern Africa, as well as the SADC Secretariat is also part of that rogue group. So SADC has been leading the rogue and regional vulnerability assessments for more than a decade. And so it's well placed to integrate AA into existing DRM frameworks, right? And there are also efforts currently underway on harmonizing the technical aspects of the AA framework. So in conclusion, Sandra, I would say that some of the key factors to promote the translation of AA include harmonization, institutionalization, and adaptation of existing DRM frameworks into existing frameworks. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Tamuka, for these reflections. I think it reminds us, of how of the multiple purposes of some of these tools and the complexities in meeting those based on what is the mandate we're trying to fulfill. That's part of what I think, at least I've seen in some of the AA type of research that we've been implementing. Thank you for sharing that with us. I would like to pause and introduce one of our panelists who I unfortunately did not introduce in the beginning, but who deserves a big thank you for joining us today. And that's Nathan Jensen from the Jamil Observatory. He's a research group lead there. Nathan, thank you so much. And please pardon me for introducing you now. Let's consider this a big welcome in the middle when everybody is finally online with us. Nathan is an applied economist working to reduce poverty and to mitigate its negative impacts. He holds a BA in physics from Luther College in Iowa and an MSc, or a Master of Science, I should say, in agriculture and applied economics from University of Missouri, and a PhD in applied economics and management from Cornell University. Much of his research has taken place among pastoralists in the Horn of Africa, focusing on resilience to shocks, the role of social protection and financial tools for building resilience and economic growth, and innovative approaches to data collection. Here he introduces himself as he will introduce himself with some of his ideas about the observatory, the work he's implementing there, which we all know is another global example for us all to learn from. So thank you again for joining us for this, Nathan. I am going to turn over and ask a question to you, Nathan. We'll stick with the same rule that's been with the others, which is 3 minutes to reply. The Jamil Observatory emphasizes anticipatory action to prevent food crises. How are you using early warning data to trigger preemptive responses? And what are some of the key barriers to making those responses timely and effective in fragile settings? What are your observations? Thanks, Nathan.
Oh yeah, thanks for the introduction. And sorry, I didn't get the question beforehand, so I'm just winging it right now, so bear with me. So I'll just say a couple words about the Jamil Observatory first and foremost. So we are a group of researchers that are located both here at the University of Edinburgh, but also at the International Livestock Research Institute in East Africa. And we're really working to convene members of those working around anticipatory action and food security in East Africa, and work to take this new kid on the block, as we just heard talked about, and apply it to pastoral areas. And what we've seen is these models of anticipatory action that have worked quite well in other regions are struggling a bit more in the pastoral areas. And this is really what made me excited about this workshop, is some of the reasons are because of things like conflict and how important conflict are, and the scarcity of data in the region. And so many of the models, including things like chirps, of course, they don't have quite as good accuracy in these dryland areas, in part because the data aren't there. So they aren't calibrated on as many MET stations. The data around conflict are often a little bit more sparse in the pastoral areas, even though there is quite a bit of conflict in the area. So we run a community of practice that meets annually in East Africa, brings together folks like WFP and FAO, and other practitioners that do work on anticipatory action and food security in the region. And we try to host sort of seminars like what's happening today, so people can learn talk to each other. There's an earlier point about sort of bringing together the scientists and the policymakers, and really that's what we see our role to be. We see this as, of course, we need to have these individuals in the same room so the scientists can learn from the policymakers. But the policymakers, of course, need to learn from the scientists, and we can continue and improve. The other thing we've been working on quite a bit is this idea of localization, and I heard people speaking about that already. We love to have this Earth observation data. It's wonderful. These global data sets are just tremendous for us. But at the same time, we need to localize this data. We need to ground truth it. We have to involve local community members in their collection and in the interpretation of early warning information so that they believe in it and so they trust it, but also so we as scientists and model developers can understand where our model's missing sort of the critical components of food security. Last but not least, I'll just say that we continue to try to build this agenda. We're going to have a community of practice in East Africa later this year, and anybody who's interested can reach out to me, and I'm happy to invite you to it.
Sign me up, Nathan. No, but first, I was just listening to you and I was thinking, obviously, we're not going to have, I mean, this is incredible, listening again to the example that you have offered us about convening in this space, how we bring together expertise in different areas to ensure solid data solutions and their application. And what I'd like to encourage folks to do is to exchange, again, use the Q&A, because our Q&A is probably going to be briefer than we had initially planned. Use the Q&A in here, share your contact information if you want to get in touch with folks who are either in the chat or on the panel or anything, and we will be facilitating those, introductions as best we can later. I'll even put my email in the chat so folks can see it and I can help to connect people. So I think it's very important that we know that the Q&A is beyond this 1 hour. So thank you very much for that, Nathan. Colleagues on the panel, we still have some questions to go through, but if we can please make your answers a bit briefer than originally expected, so we can at least get a couple questions in at the end. That would be really super. So I am going to turn over to, now of course I've got too many windows open on my computer, and I'm going to turn over to the next question, which is for Grazia. So how can early warning systems be designed to serve both humanitarian and development actors, ensuring that early signals lead to both short-term response and long-term peace building and resilience efforts? Of course, we're talking again about multiple purposes, bringing together different actors who need to make decisions, and this integration, which is becoming more and more important and imperative in this the fiscal situation we're experiencing globally. How do we do this? What are your reflections there? Thanks, Grazia.
Well, that's $1 million question, but thanks a lot, Sandy, for this responsibility. So if in the first round we spoke about how do we detect these risks, this question is about how do we act on them, right? And of course, as a researcher, I cannot stress enough the importance of the need to expand our shared evidence base. So using systems and approaches like the one shared by FuseNet or our compound risk framework or others that are available, we need to provide policymakers, humanitarian development, and peace actors with an integrated picture of risk. This is something that we've been trying to scale out to many different outlets and the countries through our climate security observatory, which is a decision support tool that integrates different layers of information, the climate, conflict, socioeconomic risk data in general, to produce what we call the climate compound risk maps. So having this shared evidence base that can be applied, can be used by humanitarian development and peace actors on these multiple structures is essential, and we need to expand our research evidence-based. So the second important point is that we need dual purpose triggers. These are layered thresholds that can activate different types of action from the same signal, from the same early warning signal. So for example, if we have a forecasted drought plus early market stress, this can trigger livelihood, social protection, development interventions. If we add a conflict layer to that, then we could trigger humanitarian surge. Then we have another 2 points that I would like to make. One is that, of course, triggers are only as good as the systems that allow the action to respond to them. So we need to, of course, you all know these prearranged coordination and financial mechanism. But one important point that I think that we cannot really present from, we cannot really avoid, is the fact that any of these early warning systems, they must be conflict sensitive and they must be linked to peace building activities. They need to have all of this at the heart of the design. So just have more information about this that you can respond during the Q&A. But over to you, Sandy, as my time is out of.
Thank you, Grazia. I'm not trying to make everybody talk faster, but it's so much good material. And this is I see a lot of people in the chat who I know who specialize in conflict. You guys know who you are, and we need to get the conversation going and take this to the next level in terms of how to make this stuff conflict sensitive. There's a great community of practice here. So Sanjeev, we're going to make this a bit quick. Which I apologize for. I'll signal you after a minute, but what governance mechanisms or institutional changes are needed to ensure that early warning systems are inclusive, transparent, and able to trigger response before tensions escalate into crises? What do you think?
So a quick answer to that, huh? We can, how much time? Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I think, as much as these processes can be very empowering to communities. And as much as data can be really, really important in actually bringing both communities, but also other actors together to really develop a better shared understanding of climate vulnerability, the current systems, I think, of governance have some really key challenges to get over. Fundamentally, I think the governance systems don't really overlay with the sort of the multidimensional nature of climate vulnerability. If you look at a lot of governance systems in the developing world, I'll speak mostly on South and Southeast Asia, which is what I'm familiar with. We still have a very prescriptive top-down approach, be it to climate change or a lot of things. Even though a lot of those systems are decentralized, the decentralization is really vertical. Whereas what climate change responses really require us to do is to work horizontally. And that's what we see at field level, that's what we see at different levels of decentralized governance. That understanding, that coin still hasn't dropped in that working in silos is simply not going to cut it when it comes to climate responses. And so that's one of the big challenges I think we face in actually bringing investments in governance systems more decentralized, more down to the subnational levels and the local levels. I think that's really, really important. And that starts with building shared understandings of what climate vulnerability really is. And I think that's where the data really comes in very strongly. But it's not just data, right? It's about how human beings actually act in cultures which are very, very ingrained in many parts of the world, which are very, very siloed and very insular. So as much as we are talking about data, governance is fundamentally about how people behave and how people think and interact. And so it's a very qualitative kind of change that we really need to bring about. Now, I think that climate change can be very powerful in this way because, I mean, certainly when I walk into a meeting with, say, for example, different government stakeholders, I can talk to them about all kinds of stuff, but climate change, everybody listens to. And really, I think, to leverage that, we do need to build a better appreciation of, the multifaceted nature of climate risk at these local levels, and really helps, subnational administrations build in coordination structures and foster, a consultative culture in the way that actually they work. And possibly, again, data can be quite interesting because it sets a baseline to actually look at whether different interventions are working or not working. And so you can actually build in, loops of evaluation and learning into governance processes that can really sort of bring home this point of actually the need to work together. So that's kind of my vision for how we might be able to deal with some of these issues, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. We have the pleasure of working together actually also in the MENA region. I'm based in Jordan and Amman. And how do we bring this localization process to countries that are hosting so many refugees or dealing with climate stress? How do we build these systems in these types of contexts? Another layer of complexity. So thank you for that. I am now going to turn over to you, Nathan, with one last question. And then, Giraj, I'm going to put you on the spot to tell us the number one question that's come up in the chat. And like I said, share your contact information in the chat if you want to get in touch with people, or if you want, or if you want people to, yeah. So the last question for you, Nathan, from your experience at the Jamil Observatory, how can partnerships between research institutions, humanitarian actors, and governments be strengthened to build integrated early warning systems that link climate, food insecurity, and displacement risks? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, first of all, I'll just say thank you very much to IWMI for bringing us all together, because I think this is an example of how that can happen. I mean, I see the number of people that are here, and I see the broad depth of experience and people working all over the world on these issues. And I know that bringing them together just in the same room, the virtual room in this case, to talk about what's happening. We learned about FuseNet to begin with, and I think some of us, at least myself, I've been a FuseNet user for a long time, but I learned that there's new tools out there that I didn't even know of. So bringing us together so we can hear what's out there and how we can work together already. We heard about breaking down silos. That's clearly a huge challenge. It's something that we've heard about for a long time. How do we practically do these things? How do we bring policymakers to community members, have different government agencies working together? I think the mention around working with the existing DRM is a really good point. So AA is sort of this hot new topic, and there's a lot of excitement about it. In theory, it's very clear what it does. But we, of course, don't need to come in there and just implement on top of existing infrastructure that's there. We can build the capacity of those groups that are already there to expand their mandate to include tools like AA. The recognition of, I think the one point that I heard earlier that I wanted to mention that I didn't, is this idea that crises and shocks are extremely dynamic and nonlinear. And so this really emphasizes the need for continued local engagement in all of these processes, because any model is going to be wrong. We can just only hope to improve it and educate all of our implementers. Hand it back to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. Couldn't be more true. Again, we need local engagement, not just to make sure these tools are right when we're constructing them, but also to guide us as we go through these processes. This is complicated, it's time consuming, it's expensive, but it's important. And building on the systems that we have and improving from there, again, a matter of efficiency in a time of scarcity, right? So thank you for that, Nathan. I think I'm gonna ask you, Giraj, for the number one question, and we'll go round the table for a 30-second answer before we do a closeout. Yeah, over to you, Giraj.
Thank you, Sandy. I think the experts have responded to most of the questions. There was one question I would just highlight, because in often the food security per se, we have various knowledge products. There was a question of what is the difference between the FuseNet and IPC, and how this can inform community level information in food security assessment. So is there anyone who would like to pick up that while Tamuka is also responding to that? Anyone would like to say what is the difference and how countries can use this product for food security assessment? Any panelists, then we can open up one or two questions for the participants to ask.
I can just quickly respond. I mean, Tamuka is much more of an expert. He's been doing this for way longer than I have. But really briefly, I mean, so the intended FuseNet creates the IPC classification that is kind of standardized across all countries. So basically, we need to use the same approach and we need to look at what is emergency or famine in one country and be able to compare that directly to another country, another place in the world, because that's to inform where the U.S. needs to send food assistance. So it's kind of this across the board, we're kind of standardizing it so we understand where people most need. Whereas individually in a country, the IPC is very country specific, can't be really compared directly to another country because it's within the context of that country. The methods are unique to that country. So it's more of a global look of a standardized product versus when you're just a national interest and want to know what's happening in that country. That's my brief overview, but Tamuka, feel free to step in and clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think given there are quite a number of more than 100 plus people joined, we would like to ask one participant to ask any questions to our experts, given the limited time. Please raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask the question.
Raising hand is better.
Yeah, please go ahead. Anyone would like to ask question? I don't see so far, but again, Sandy would like to provide any message at this point. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
I just said this has been a tremendously dynamic group to learn from. So thank you for taking the time to share all of this with us. And please do help us keep the conversation going. I'm going to make a shameless plug, Giraj, for the fact that the Food Frontiers and Security Program of the CGIAR, we have a what we call our Frontiers Learning Exchange webinar series. So stay tuned. You can watch IWMI's LinkedIn channel. We always push this stuff out so you can see it there and on the CGIAR channels. So watch for that. There will be more conversations that relate to this to come. So thank you. And yeah, let's keep learning together. So I think now, Giraj, shall I turn it over to Nathan for some closing words?
Yeah, so I don't have much to say, but I just want to say this is a 19 webinar series in a series that started in March. The next one is on hydropower early warning. We have global experts joining around the world on similar segment. So if you are interested, do join and register yourself. And thank you again for staying with us. And the synthesis report will be available from all the recordings that we are doing here. So once again, thanks to all the speakers and also our moderator for doing the great job. And apologize, Nathan, at the last minute, we could not pitch you in the right time, but nevertheless, you did an amazing job. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very